Hello and welcome to Warrior Maven, the Center for Military Modernization. Really important opportunity for a conversation today. We're joined by a decorated combat veteran, Mr. Scott Rutter. He not only served in the Gulf War, but also commanded an infantry battalion, a company during Operation Rocky Freedom, and not only engaged, but destroyed members of the Republican Guard at the famous Baghdad airport confrontation. He's gone on to be an advocate for veterans, families impacted by war, as well as business and supports DOD. It's a pleasure to have Mr. Rutter here. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Chris, glad to be on board. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Obviously, it's turning to a significant situation with the impending invasion. Perhaps, as some have said, even President Biden said the invasion has already begun with the initial incursion. What do you think, as an expert with Cold War, Russian tactics, infantry, tip of the spear, what do you think this kind of invasion is going to look like, just generally, in terms of armored vehicles going across the border?
It's a hybrid version of what we studied in the 1970s and 1980s, the Blitzkrieg, or the actual force march from the Russians coming across the border and so forth. This time, it's a little bit different, more getting in, seizing key intersections, moving artillery, 152 millimeter mortar in order to support those BTR 80s that we've seen on the news, driving on the road in order to gain that key terrain, but also to get ready to spearhead with tanks, T-80s, T-90s, as things go on. The thing to watch in the future is to take a look at the ballistic missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, how the operational echelon moves forward. Obviously, Putin has the tactical echelons moving forward with the artillery, so forth. Not a lot of air defense probably, but supplementing that with additional resources in order to gain that fire superiority, which the Russians do so elegantly correct.
A couple of quick things here. First of all, what about the Javelin anti-tank missiles? You would know firsthand they were effective against Iraqi tanks and OAF. They can't kill tanks reportedly. What kind of an impact do you expect them to have, particularly when you just look at the geography of Ukraine? The eastern portion is pretty flat, lots of plains, kind of open in a way for tanks to maneuver and move forward, whereas the mountains are in the west. Do you think they can really slow this down if they're armed with javelins?
That's a great question. You know, we actually had the Javelin during the assault of the Republican Guard at the airport. Very, very effective weapon system, but like any weapon systems going against combined arms maneuver, how the Ukrainians build that engagement area. It has to be enhanced with artillery. It has to be enhanced with minefields. Javelin on its own against a penetration of a Russian force, whether wheeled or whether tracked, is doomed for failure. It needs to be combined with artillery and even close air support in order to gain those coalition, to get those right aspects of the amount of combat calculus that needs to happen in order to destroy the massive amount of armored forces which will come over, and the same time for protecting dismounted soldiers against indirect fire weapon systems, specifically the 152s, tracked howitzers that are moving forward now as we speak.
Roger that. Well, I understand the Javelin can fire from either a tactical vehicle or dismounted units. Should the terrain be hospitable, perhaps they could hide indefinitely behind a rock, a tree, use the terrain to their advantage, and try and take out some of the tanks.
Absolutely. But if you do that battlefield calculus and the enhancement of those enablers that I spoke about, the engineering, equipment, and I'm talking about wire, minefields combined with artillery, that's how things become effective. Direct fire going against a blitzkrieg type of an operation without those enablers, us using cyber or other type of engineering or artillery coming in against those movements in order to break up their synchronization must happen in order to make the Russians fight in multiple directions and sort of keep them off balance rather than coming head on.
Roger, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about the tank incursions. And so what kinds of tank movements do you expect us to see? And would there be something like CQB, close quarter battle, whereas something like a T-90 might have trouble maneuvering in an urban environment? Will there be house-to-house shooting?
Yeah, I think the T-90s are going to be pushed forward. I'm sensitive to how the terrain is over there. Obviously, the mud, the unfrozen terrain and so forth. Probably why we're not seeing a lot of tanks and we're seeing more of the BTR-80s moving forward. I think Putin and his tactical commanders will mitigate some of that risk of not pushing the tanks up as quickly as we thought, with mainly some light infantry coming into play. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an air assault operation, battalion size operation, in order to focus us, in order to allow the time for the tanks in order to move forward, to stay on the roads, in order to gain a position of advantage.
Roger that. Will we see any kind of Su-57 fifth generation air support? Obviously, helicopters, you mentioned the possibility of air assault raids. Does Ukraine's force, which by any calculus or estimation is infinitely smaller, what can they really accomplish, as you point out, with this integrated approach, minefields, artillery, javelins? What kind of chance, if any, do they have to slow this thing down?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely needs to have those enablers besides the Javelin. We're just hearing the Javelin. We're not hearing the type of minefields, the type of equipment that's needed out there in order to block, in order to disrupt, synchronization, in order to allow the enemy vehicles to be exposed much more in an engagement area. Do I think that the Russians are going to use attack helicopters? Absolutely. And not to say that they're going to use them against dismounts. They may be looking at some sort of a counterattack, a motorized counterattack that the Ukrainians may be able to assemble in order to try to hit the Russians on the flank, of their movement, and to stall their movement a bit.
Roger, I want to ask about EW and cyber, but first, when it comes to some kind of resistance against a Russian attack, I imagine with Ukrainian forces, we're not going to see a linear mechanized force-on-force kind of operation. You're more likely to see hit and run, obscuring with the terrain, various long-range artillery, as you mentioned. What options do they have available if they're not in a position to kind of do that armored confrontation?
I think it's almost going to be like what the Republican Guard attempted to do to us as we were moving up, find key terrain and key intersections to disrupt the formations and so forth, and have their defense in depth in order to basically reduce their capability to break them up and so forth. Yet to be determined is if NATO or other forces are going to be used, close air support, to come in order to engage those high value targets, which may be the 152s, the actual tanks, which may be stalled as it comes in. The Iraqis were a little bit effective as we were moving up on key intersections. They knew that if they mass, it wouldn't really surmise to anything. But being able to hold those key intersections to destroy and disrupt and delay us is probably what the Ukrainians are going to attempt to do.
Sure, interesting. When you brought to mind the idea of air support and helicopter raids, one of the things that occurred to me was the F-35 and the growing number of European countries. Sure enough, just yesterday, Secretary Austin says they'll be forward to the eastern NATO flank. Obviously, not saying exactly where, but you have to think in terms of deterrence. A lot of public reports say the Russians have a handful of Su-57s, and that's even assuming if it could match an F-35. So if there's a network group, a squadron of F-35, at least on the border as a deterrent, you have to think that has a significant effect, whether or not they are ever ordered to intervene, which of course the Pentagon has said we won't fight in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I would think that the targeting activity that's going on probably right now is being focused more on the operational enhancements that may be pushed forward in order to support this attack, whether it's additional multiple rocket launchers and those larger, SU type artillery pieces and so forth. For the Russians, another story. They're on the attack. They are going to want to support their ground tactical commanders with the appropriate close air support, but more importantly, clearly they're thinking about the deep fight and how they fight the deep fight. You can imagine that the Russians may have Spetsnaz and different special operation forces deep within the Ukraine, identifying high value targets already targeted for the Russians in order to engage. I think that's going to be the real threat from those aircraft that that the Russians may use and may launch if that happens. But then again, Putin may be calculating. He may be looking at just taking a limited attack a limited terrain assault in order to gain different areas within the Ukraine and call it a day, and then go into a hasty defense and look at bringing up some operational forces in order to still get us thinking that there is going to be a follow-on attack and things could continue. I think he's pretty wise. I think he's taken advantage of the situation. And I think first things first, he's going to get a foothold, and then it's going to be expectation management after that of what he does and so forth. And our collection mechanisms, the ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, both sides, advancements in that, taking a look at large masses of formations that may be in depth of the formation or other type of activities that are actually out there. Trust me, U.S. as well as the Russians are doing that equally together.
Well, as a student and expert of Russian tactics, Cold War history, and then, of course, an experienced combat veteran, what are a couple of things that might be unique or specific to Russian combat tactics and strategies that obviously Ukrainians are going to be on the lookout for? Is there anything unique to how they wage war? There must be.
I think right now it's probably the penetration of their defenses. And if they do penetrate, how much do they exploit? And how far do they go for some sort of encirclement, or if they're going to continue to envelop and, move to Kyiv, the capital and so forth. So I think that's the major threat. But I think that Putin's going to continue to have that on his mind, but yet to be determined. And obviously the U.S. has taken a look at that. How far does he go, as well as our NATO forces, Estonia and Latvia to the north and so forth. This is a threat and so forth. Unlike the Ukraine and Finland that have sort of had relationships with the Russians over the years, the other countries have not, and have definitely separated and have stepped up to the plate. And the Ukrainians have too. I don't want to sell them short.
Sure. Now, one of the things that General Murray, the former commander of Army Futures Command, said to me when talking about IRCA, the long-range artillery for the Army, was that the 2014 Russian incursion to parts of Ukraine and, of course, Crimea's annexation was what he called a bit of a wake-up call for the U.S. Now, obviously, it's not to say in any respect their systems are comparable or can compete with the U.S., but if we think 8 years later, some of the specific things they were credited or observed to be capable of, electronic warfare, cyber intrusions, the use of drones, for example, these things are now 8 years more evolved. Are there any kinds of paradigm-changing techniques or technologies you think we might see with this?
I think it's the ISR capabilities of us identifying those extremely high value targets, the cyber equipment that they're pushing forward or may even have within depth of their formation and so forth. But I think that's the critical piece in order to identify those locations. Now, whether that's with individuals on the ground or through satellite or through drones and UAVs, I definitely think that the deep battle focus, although reconnaissance right now is definitely gathering information in order to target key assets that are definitely discriminators that the Russians have.
Thank you very much. We were joined today at the center by a great American, a patriot, a combat decorated veteran who helped the effort in OIF. We're grateful to have your perspective and your expertise at this very pivotal and crucial moment in history. Mr. Rutter, thank you so much for being with us.